Picture the pod hanging from the trunk of a tree in a hot, dripping rainforest, and understand, before we go any further, that it looks nothing like chocolate. It is a strange, ridged, oblong thing the size of a small football, colored in yellows and oranges and deep reds, growing not from the branches where you would expect fruit to grow, but directly from the trunk and the thickest limbs, as though the tree had decided the normal rules of where fruit belongs did not apply to it. Crack it open and you do not find anything you would recognize as the origin of the sweetest, most beloved treat on earth. You find a cluster of seeds wrapped in a wet, white, slippery pulp. And the seeds themselves, if you bite into one raw, are appallingly bitter, so bitter and astringent that your first instinct is to spit it out and wonder what could possibly be wrong with a person who looked at this and thought, one day this will be dessert. That is where chocolate begins. Not with sweetness, not with a bar or a drink or anything anyone today would recognize. It begins with a bitter seed inside a strange pod on a tree in the tropical forests of the Americas, and with the long, patient, ingenious work of the ancient peoples who took that impossibly unpromising raw material and, over thousands of years, transformed it into something they valued so highly that they used it as money, offered it to their gods, reserved it for their kings, and believed it carried a power that was very nearly divine. This is the story of how they did it, how human beings looked at one of the least obvious foods in the natural world and, through a process of discovery that must have taken generations, unlocked something hidden inside it. It is a story that runs backwards from everything you associate with chocolate, because almost nothing you associate with chocolate was there at the start. No sugar, no milk, no sweetness at all. What there was, instead, was a bitter, potent, complicated substance that the ancient Americas treated not as a candy, but as something far more serious. And the journey from that to the thing melting on your tongue is one of the great, strange, and largely forgotten adventures in the history of food. Let's start with the tree, because everything flows from the tree, and the tree is genuinely odd. The cacao tree is a creature of the deep tropical forest, a plant that wants heat and shade and constant moisture, that grows in the understory beneath the great canopy, sheltered from direct sun. It is native to the American tropics, to the vast forested regions of Central and South America, and it has that peculiar habit we already mentioned, growing its flowers and its fruit directly from its trunk and main branches rather than from the outer twigs. This is unusual enough that it has a name, and it gives the tree a strange appearance, hung with those large ridged pods sprouting straight from the woody trunk. The pods do not open on their own. They do not fall and split invitingly. To get at what is inside, something has to break them, and in the wild, that something was the animals of the forest, monkeys and other creatures that would crack the pods open, drawn not to the bitter seeds, but to that sweet white pulp surrounding them, eating the pulp and discarding or passing the seeds, and in doing so, spreading the tree through the forest. And here, almost certainly, is where the human story begins. Not with anyone seeking out the bitter seed, but with someone seeking the sweet pulp. Because that pulp is genuinely delicious, tangy and sweet and refreshing, and the earliest relationship between humans and the cacao tree was very likely about the pulp, not the seed at all. Ancient people in the American tropics, like the animals before them, would have cracked open the pods to get at that sweet white flesh, sucking it from around the seeds, enjoying the fruit, and very probably, at first, throwing the bitter seeds away exactly as everyone's instinct still says they should. There is even good evidence that one of the very first things humans did with cacao was ferment that pulp into a mild alcoholic drink. The pulp is sugary, and sugary things left in the warm tropical air begin to ferment on their own, and a fermented cacao pulp beverage may well have been among the earliest human uses of the tree, the fruit valued as a drink long before anyone cared about the seeds inside it. This is worth sitting with, because it upends the whole intuitive story. We assume chocolate began with someone recognizing the value of the cacao bean. But the bean, the thing we now consider the entire point, may have been for a very long time the discarded byproduct, the bitter waste left over after the good part, the sweet pulp, had been eaten or fermented and enjoyed. The seed that would eventually conquer the world started out as garbage. So how did the garbage become treasure? How did anyone get from throwing the bitter seeds away to treating them as one of the most precious substances in their entire civilization? This is the heart of the mystery, and it is a mystery because no one wrote it down at the time. The crucial discoveries happened deep in the pre-literate past, and we can only reconstruct the logic of what must have happened, not the specific moments when it did. But the logic is fascinating because turning a raw cacao seed into anything resembling chocolate requires not one discovery but a whole chain of them, each one non-obvious, each one a real leap. The first leap was fermentation of the seeds themselves, and this may have happened almost by accident as a consequence of the way people were already handling the pods. When you scoop out the seeds along with their pulp and let them sit, as you might if you were collecting them or processing the pulp, the seeds ferment inside that sugary flesh. And fermentation does something crucial and invisible to the seed. It begins to break down some of the harsh bitterness, and it triggers chemical changes inside the bean that develop the compounds responsible for what we would eventually recognize as chocolate flavor. A raw, unfermented cacao seed can never become chocolate no matter what you do to it afterward. The flavor simply is not there yet. It has to be created, and fermentation is the step that begins creating it. So the first ancestor of chocolate was almost certainly discovered not through anyone's intention, but through the natural fermentation of seeds left sitting in their own pulp. A happy accident that transformed a purely bitter seed into something with the hidden potential for flavor locked inside it. The second leap was drying and then roasting. A fermented seed is still not chocolate, it is wet and it will rot if left alone. Drying it in the sun preserved it, and roasting it over heat did something more. It deepened and developed the flavor further, driving off harshness, browning the bean, coaxing out the rich complex notes that roasting brings to so many foods. Anyone who has smelled coffee roasting or bread baking knows the transformation that heat works on certain foods, turning something mild or raw into something deep and aromatic. And roasting did the same for the fermented cacao bean, taking it another long step down the road toward the flavor we know. The third leap was grinding. The roasted bean is hard, and it is still not something you would want to eat as it is. But grind it, crush it between stones, work it into a paste, and something remarkable happens because the cacao bean is full of fat, an enormous amount of fat. And when you grind the roasted bean, that fat is released, and the whole thing turns from a dry solid into a thick, rich, oily paste. This paste is the true ancestor of all chocolate, the substance from which everything else descends. It is intense, bitter, fatty, powerfully flavored, and it is what the ancient peoples of the Americas learned to make and to prize. Not a solid bar. That would come much, much later and require techniques they did not have, but a paste, a ground mass of roasted fermented cacao, which they then did the thing that defined ancient chocolate above all else. They mixed it with water and they drank it. Because this is the single most important thing to understand about chocolate for almost its entire history. It was not a food you ate, it was a drink. For thousands of years, across all the great civilizations of ancient Mesoamerica, chocolate meant a beverage, a drink made from ground cacao mixed with water and flavored with other things, consumed cold or at room temperature, frothy, bitter, and utterly unlike the sweet solid we think of today. The word we use, chocolate, descends from the words those peoples used for this drink. The idea of chocolate as something you chew rather than sip would have made no sense to them at all. Chocolate was liquid, and it was the liquid form that they built, an entire culture of value and ritual around. It is worth pausing on just how deep in time this goes, because the antiquity of it is part of what makes it remarkable. The human relationship with cacao is not a few centuries old or even 1,000 or 2,000 years old. It reaches back thousands of years into the era of the earliest complex societies of the region, and the knowledge of how to process the bean was already old by the time the civilizations we know best inherited it. One culture handed the craft to the next, refining and elaborating it, so that by the time of the great, famous civilizations of ancient Mesoamerica, chocolate was not a new discovery, but an ancient inheritance, a technology and a tradition already carrying the weight of countless generations behind it. When we picture the ruler drinking his frothed, spiced chocolate from an ornate vessel, we should understand that he was participating in a practice already almost unimaginably old, a chain of knowledge stretching back through his ancestors into a past that even he could not have seen the beginning of. And the tree, and the knowledge of what to do with it, spread across a huge region and passed between many peoples. Cacao grew in particular tropical zones, but the drink and the beans that made it traveled far beyond where the trees would grow, carried along trade routes, exchanged between societies, valued everywhere they went. This spread is itself a kind of proof of how prized the substance was, because things that are not valued do not travel. They stay where they are and are forgotten. Cacao traveled constantly, moving as trade good and tribute and treasure across the ancient Americas, which tells us that wherever it went, people recognized and wanted what it was. A whole network of exchange grew up around the bean, connecting the forests where it grew to the cities and courts where it was drunk, and the fact that such a network existed at all is evidence of the extraordinary status this bitter forest seed had achieved. Now let's talk about what that drink was actually like, because it is so far from a modern hot chocolate that calling them the same thing is almost misleading. Ancient Mesoamerican chocolate was bitter. There was no sugar in the Americas as a sweetener in the way we know it, no cane sugar to cut the natural bitterness of the cacao, and so the drink kept much of the intensity that we now carefully mask. It was often flavored, but not with the flavors we would choose. It was mixed with things like chili peppers, giving it heat, and with a fragrant flour that added an aromatic note, and with cornmeal and with other spices and flavorings depending on the place and the occasion. The result was a drink that was rich, bitter, spicy, complex and stimulating, closer in spirit to a strong, spiced, savory beverage than to anything sweet. And crucially, it was frothy. The froth mattered enormously. The drink was prepared by pouring it from one vessel to another, from a height, again and again, to raise a thick foam on top, and that foam was considered the best part, the most desirable portion of the drink. Special vessels and techniques existed purely to generate and serve that froth. To drink chocolate in the ancient Americas was to drink something bitter and spiced and crowned with a prized foam, a world away from a sweet, warm mug. And this drink was not ordinary. This is the part that reveals how completely the meaning of chocolate has changed, because in the ancient Americas, cacao was not a casual treat available to everyone. It was precious. It was, in a very literal and specific sense, valuable, because the cacao bean was used as money. This is one of the genuinely astonishing facts about ancient chocolate, and it is worth pausing on. The cacao bean functioned as a form of currency across Mesoamerica. People bought and sold with cacao beans. Goods were priced in them. You could pay for things, food, cloth, labor, with counted quantities of cacao. It was a commodity money, a thing valued both for what it was and for what it could be exchanged for, and this dual nature made it extraordinary. Imagine a currency you could also drink, money that was also a luxury good, wealth that could be either spent or consumed. That was cacao. And because it was money, and because it was labor-intensive to produce and grew only in certain regions, it carried a value that placed the chocolate drink firmly in the realm of the precious. This was not a beverage for everyone every day. It was a substance associated with wealth, with status, with the elite, and with the powerful, precisely because the beans it was made from were themselves a store of value. There is a reason cacao held its value so reliably, and it comes back to the tree, which does not give up its treasure easily. Cacao is demanding to grow. It wants specific conditions, the heat and shade and moisture of the tropical forest, and it does not thrive just anywhere. It takes years for a tree to begin producing, and the pods must be harvested, opened, and the beans extracted and fermented and dried and processed through every one of those laborious steps before they become anything usable. This meant that cacao could never be casually abundant. It required the right land, sustained effort, and real skill, and the quantity available was always limited by all of that. A thing that is hard to produce and cannot be made just anywhere holds its value well, and cacao's status as precious money and precious drink rested on this stubborn material fact. There was only ever so much of it, and getting it took real work, and that scarcity was built into the nature of the tree itself. Which brings us to who actually drank it, and why the drink carried such weight. Chocolate, in the great civilizations of ancient Mesoamerica, was the drink of the powerful. It was consumed by rulers, by nobles, by priests, by warriors, by the people at the top of society, and in the institutions that mattered. It appeared at feasts and ceremonies. It was served to the elite as a mark of their status, and the ability to consume it freely was itself a signal of wealth and rank. In some societies, it was closely associated with rulers and the nobility specifically, a drink whose consumption helped mark the boundary between the powerful and everyone else. To be served chocolate, and the quality and quantity of the chocolate you were served, said something about who you were. But its importance went beyond status into the sacred. Cacao was woven deeply into the religious and cosmological life of these civilizations. It was regarded as a gift from the gods, associated with divine origins, tied to deities and to the sacred order of the world. It featured in religious rituals and offerings. It was connected, in the symbolism of these cultures, to blood and to life and to the vital forces of existence, its rich, dark liquid carrying associations that made it far more than a pleasant drink. It was used in ceremonies marking the great transitions of life. It accompanied the dead. It was present at the moments a society considered most charged with meaning. Chocolate was not merely a luxury, it was a sacred substance, a thing that connected the human and the divine, valued for a significance that ran far deeper than taste. And there was the matter of what chocolate did to you, because the ancient peoples who prized it were not wrong to sense that it was more than ordinary food. Cacao contains stimulant compounds, substances related to the ones in coffee and tea, that produce a genuine physical effect, a lift, an energizing and mood-altering quality that a person drinking it would feel. In a world without coffee, without tea, without the array of stimulants we take for granted, a drink that made you feel more alert, more energized, more capable would have been genuinely remarkable and genuinely valued. Warriors were associated with it, and it was regarded as a source of strength and vigor. This was not superstition attached to an inert substance. Chocolate really did do something to the body and mind of the person who drank it, and the ancient reverence for it was rooted, at least in part, in the real effects of a genuinely psychoactive, stimulating food. It is worth appreciating how unusual that made it in its world. We live surrounded by stimulants, coffee in the morning, tea in the afternoon, an endless array of energizing drinks engineered and sold on every corner. And so a substance that perks you up feels utterly ordinary to us, hardly worth remarking on. But in a society that had none of these things, a drink that reliably made you feel sharper and stronger and more alive was close to miraculous. It would have seemed to contain a genuine power, a real force that entered the body and changed it, and the people who felt that force were feeling something true. When they called cacao a gift of the gods and tied it to strength and vitality and the sacred energies of life, they were not merely decorating a pleasant flavor with pretty words. They were describing, in the language available to them, the real experience of consuming a powerful, active substance, and honoring it accordingly. Now step back and look at the whole achievement, because it is easy to take chocolate for granted and miss how genuinely improbable its discovery was. Consider everything that had to happen. Someone had to move past the sweet pulp and take an interest in the bitter, discarded seed. Someone had to discover, probably by accident, that letting those seeds ferment in their pulp began to transform them. Someone had to learn to dry and then to roast the fermented beans, developing the flavor further through heat. Someone had to grind the roasted beans and discover the rich paste that the released fat produced. Someone had to work out how to combine that paste with water and other ingredients into a drink, and how to froth it and how to flavor it. Every one of these steps is non-obvious. Every one required someone to do something to a thoroughly unpromising material and notice that it had gotten a little better, and to pass that knowledge on, and for the next person to build on it. The full chain of discovery that turns a bitter forest seed into a prized ceremonial drink is not the kind of thing one clever person invents in an afternoon. It is the accumulated work of many people across many generations, each adding a step, the whole process stretching across a span of time so long that its beginnings are lost entirely to us. And this is the thing that the story of chocolate reveals so clearly, the thing worth carrying away from it. The foods we take for granted are almost never obvious. We inherit them in their finished, refined, delicious form, and we assume that their value was always apparent, that of course people would want chocolate, of course they would figure out how to make it. But nothing about chocolate was obvious, nothing about it announced itself. The raw material actively discourages you. The seed is bitter, the process is long, the flavor has to be created through fermentation and roasting and grinding before it exists at all. The people who discovered chocolate were not handed a treat. They were handed a bitter seed in a strange pod, and through patience and curiosity and the accumulated ingenuity of generations, they built the treat themselves, one non-obvious step at a time. There is a rehabilitation worth making here, because there is a lazy tendency to imagine the ancient discovery of foods as a kind of stumbling luck, primitive people accidentally falling into things they did not understand. But look at what the ancient Mesoamericans actually accomplished with cacao, and that condescension collapses. They developed a multi-stage processing technology: ferment, dry, roast, grind, mix, froth. That is essentially the same sequence of steps used to make chocolate today. They understood the plant, cultivated it, traded it, built a currency around it, and integrated it into the deepest levels of their religious and social life. This was not luck. This was knowledge, hard-won and carefully maintained and passed down with precision across generations, a genuine and sophisticated mastery of a difficult natural material. The people who gave the world chocolate were not fumbling in the dark. They were expert processors of one of the most challenging and rewarding plants their environment had to offer. And the proof of their expertise is that we still, fundamentally, make chocolate the way they worked out how to make it. The sweetness came later, and it came from elsewhere. When the drink eventually traveled beyond the Americas and encountered cane sugar, it was transformed, sweetened, warmed, eventually combined with milk, and much later still turned from a drink into the solid bars we know, through techniques that separated and recombined the fat and the solids of the bean in ways the ancient world never imagined. The chocolate you eat today is the product of that later chapter, the sweetening and the industrializing and the reinventing of an ancient drink into a modern candy. But underneath all of it, at the very foundation, is the achievement of those first peoples who did the impossible part, the part that could not be skipped, who took the bitter seed and discovered how to make it delicious in Asia, the first place. Every refinement since has been built on top of their discovery. None of it would exist without the original, patient, generations-long work of transformation that happened in the tropical forests of the ancient Americas. So, the next time chocolate is melting on your tongue, sweet and smooth and effortless, Let your mind travel back past all of it, past the sugar and the milk and the machines, past the bars and the boxes, all the way back to the pod hanging from the trunk of a tree in a dripping forest, and to the bitter seed inside it that no sane person should ever have looked at twice. Somebody looked at it anyway. Somebody, and then many somebodies, across uncounted years, did the slow, difficult, unglamorous work of turning that bitter seed into treasure, and they did it so well and valued the result so highly that they paid their debts with it and offered it to their gods. They found the sweetness that was never there, not by luck, but by refusing to accept that a bitter seed was only ever going to be bitter, which may be the most human thing anyone has ever done with a plant.